also interested in developing a fellowship program aimed at graduate students and other professionals who are interested in what we're calling immersion experiences, wherein someone engages with another tradition at very deep levels of dialogue and practice and study, so that we can have a generation of people who are fully lingual or bilingual, as Randy likes to call it, with a variety of faith traditions. And we think that that's something that could really benefit the LDS Church and its members going forward. One can realize God through all religions, and the one we've all heard numerous times, I believe. All religions are different paths leading up the same mountain. As many a philosopher has pointed out, the assumption behind all of these images is the idea that we have some idea what it is that is the source of the diversity within religions. Many of us have heard the parable of the blind men and the elephant. And the parable is that you have a number of blind men grabbing a part of the elephant and asserting that that is the elephant. So you have one man grabbing the trunk and saying this is the elephant, another grabbing the tail, another the ear, and so on. But again, the assumption behind this parable is that there is a context from which one can tell what they are really touching is indeed an elephant. And this leads us to the challenges of religious pluralism. There are a lot of issues here, and it was hard to try to distill this, but you can pare it down, I believe, to two main issues. The first one is the challenge of theological imperialism, and that is the charge that pluralist thinking is actually a form of theological imperialism, mostly in the form of a kind of abstracted Protestant sensibility. That's certainly present with John Hick and Kent Will Smith and others, and there's been a lot of discussion along these lines. The second is what you can call the challenge of homogenization, and that is what is known as the problem of thinner theology. And it's the image to keep in mind is that the broader one goes, the thinner one has to go in terms of what you're able to say theologically. I'd like to point out that the way I've always thought about Mormonism is that it began with the problem of religious diversity. Joseph Smith was deeply puzzled by the existence of the varying religious sects. And of course, the form that religious diversity took in early 19th century America was interdenominational Christian diversity. Nevertheless, the questions and puzzlement were the same for him. Christian diversity was especially scandalous in the environment in which Joseph Smith grew up, and has been rather a scandal for the Christian world at large. Despite its contemporary social alignment with conservative forms of Christianity, Mormonism, I believe, is remarkably pluralistic in its theological outlook, but it's also remarkably exclusivistic. It cuts across the traditional typology of pluralism, inclusivism, and exclusivism, which some of us have learned in our beginning religious studies classes. Like other traditions, there have been ebbs and flows in the history of LDS teaching. Certain ideas in the repository of the faith will come to the fore and have come to the fore, while others fade into the background. Some are viewed as better left to history, while others are rekindled and given new life relative to contemporary circumstances. New questions emerge in light of new experiences, relationships, and interest. So the question perhaps we can ask ourselves in this conference is, to what extent are new questions emerging in light of the church's renewed, perhaps, interest in interreligious affairs? Eugene England poses the challenge for us in a particularly penetrating way, and one that is characteristic of his writing. He says, "What are we to make of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God, who by nature is concerned equally about all his children, but whose absolutely crucial message of salvation he can only communicate to a very small fraction of those children. Certainly less than 10% of the estimated 70 billion people who have lived on the earth have even heard the Christian gospel. Perhaps 2 or 3% have accepted it, and something like 0.01% have been Latter-day Saints. The LDS Newsroom commentary, Respect for a Diversity of Faiths, which has been mentioned repeatedly throughout the day, includes relatively strong inclusivist language. In addition to restating the virtues of kindness and respect, the document affirms Krister Stendahl's rules for religious understanding, which should include his dictum that we should, quote, leave room for holy envy, end quote. Also included is the idea that we should seek to emulate the virtues of other faiths. This document quotes with approval Orson F. Whitney's statement that, quote, God is using more than one people for the accomplishment of his great and marvelous work. And this was quoted by Elder Porter this morning. The Latter-day Saints cannot do it all, Whitney says. It is too vast, too arduous for any one people. Another intriguing document in this regard is the authority in the church section of the church's newsroom page. This states, although Latter-day Saints believe that divine authority was lost in the ancient church after the death of the apostles and required a restoration by divine intervention, they do not dismiss or diminish the validity of other people's religious experiences. Though none of these statements directly affirms strong inclusivism of Bronner's variety, they certainly point us in the direction here and raise questions regarding their implications. Precisely what elements should be emulated in other faiths? What form should this emulation take? How much should we openly discuss what we envy in other religions? What does validity mean when it comes to diverse religious experiences? I'll leave these questions open and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. What we sought to do at this conference was to focus on the Abrahamic traditions first. We fully intend to host events dealing with a broader variety of religions, but we thought, given the fact that this was our inaugural event, that we would focus on this family of religions, and we think that it's come together quite well. So the question is, who are we? What kind of an organization is this Mormon chapter? And as you see here, we are a group of Latter-day Saints with backgrounds in comparative religions, public policy, theological studies, public relations, diplomacy, legal studies, etc., etc. There is a lot of variety within the chapter. We've purposefully sought out people with different backgrounds and perspectives and specializations who all share a common interest in peaceable relations and interreligious understanding, shared projects, etc. As you can guess, we're an independent group. We don't have any official affiliation with the church, but we do have an official representative who is part of the chapter from the Public Affairs Office, and that is Nathan Nilsson. Nathan, will you raise your hand? He's our link to the institutional church. Despite all the other informal links, he's the one we work through. And we're grateful for that relationship. As you well know, and as you'll hear throughout the conference, there's quite a bit of movement on the part of the LDS Church in terms of interreligious relations. And we hope that you will become more familiar with some of those projects. Elder Porter will talk about some this morning and again throughout the conference. But one of the documents that we think is a kind of foundational document for what we're trying to do is the newsroom commentary called the Respect for Diversity of Faiths. And I just pulled out a couple of quotes for you to look at, but I encourage you to read that, and you'll find it in your packet as well. But it affirms here, Latter-day Saints accept all sincere believers as equals in the pursuit of faith and in the great work of serving humanity. And then it goes on later in the statement to quote Krister Stendahl. Some of you know him as the former dean of the Harvard Divinity School, where we're encouraged to leave room for what Stendhal called holy envy by finding elements in other faiths to emulate. These principles foster relationships between religions that build trust and lay the groundwork for charitable efforts. And so with this kind of document and other efforts in mind, we think that we are fully within the spirit of what our church and our tradition is trying to do, and we're delighted to do that. An important example is the Dalai Lama's new book, hot off the press, Toward a True Kinship of Faiths, subtitled, How the World's Religions Can Come Together. In connection to the book, he published an op-ed contribution in the New York Times entitled, Many Faiths, One Truth. And he ends with this statement. Harmony among the major faiths has become an essential ingredient of peaceful coexistence in our world. From this perspective, mutual understanding among these traditions is not merely the business of religious believers, it matters for the welfare of humanity as a whole. End quote. To Stephen Prothero, however, this kind of thinking has what he calls, quote, a lovely sentiment, but it doesn't contain much content. Prothero has just published his latest work, God is Not One, subtitled The 8 Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. This was published, I believe, in March. In this work, he takes on this kind of genteel pluralism and argues that we must account for both the ugly and the beautiful in the religions. Pluralists have a tendency, so he argues, to minimize religious particularity in favor of a kind of austere and abstract essence. And this leads us to our core questions and challenges us to unsnarl the knot of religious diversity, namely, how to see other traditions in relation to one's own without doing injustice to their deeply held and sacred beliefs.